Hello there everyone, UXW Bill here once again. The time has rolled around at last to test the second in line of the three Dell OptiPlex 760 series computers that I recently picked up. This is by far and away the most stripped example. Someone had pulled the power supply and all of the memory out of this unit, and I recently borrowed a few more parts from it to fix up one of the other machines. Over here I have the Core 2 8400 based machine that seems to be perfectly functional. Its optical drive did not work, so not only did I steal the optical drive out of this machine, which does appear to work, but I also decided to add a floppy disk drive as well, something that I will probably do with all of these machines, or as many of them as I happen to get working. Unfortunately, this one may be very well consigned to the parts bin, as I'd say it has a pretty serious problem. I'm afraid that I concur completely with the people who initially diagnosed it, as when I hooked a power supply up to it, a very good power supply in case you were wondering, one of these very serious 550 watt models originally intended for use in some kind of a Sun workstation and available at one point very cheaply on the second-hand market. You could buy them in, I think, lots of 3 and lots of 10, and they were definitely a very good buy while they were around, despite the fact that they need a little bit of adaptation to work in a standard PC. But I digress. In addition to connecting a known working power supply, I also located a known good DDR2 memory module and put it in this machine. When I first connected power to the machine, it powered right up and immediately went to some sort of a fault display indication. Now, I don't know if the fault code that this thing is indicating is truly a valid code or not, but what happened when I powered it up was a solid amber power LED, and then LEDs 3 and 4 in the diagnostic center here behind this smoked bezel cover were blinking green. I went ahead and punched up the Dell service manual for this machine, and as you can see, I've got the fault code that seems to have been indicated there at the top of the screen. The only thing that seems to be odd about this, they say that the power light should be steady amber, but the color of the diagnostic indicator seems like it would imply that they are to be amber colored as well. I've never known those diagnostic indicators on these machines to be amber in color at any point throughout the power on self-test, and I also don't know if they're supposed to blink or not to indicate this particular failure. But something would definitely seem to be fairly seriously wrong here, as even when I remove the memory module it still complains. And what's more, with this fan disconnected, this massive front panel fan that a lot of people have commented about already, it doesn't seem that the CPU, the north bridge, or the south bridge ever get any appreciable amount of heat in them, so I'm wondering if they're even getting any kind of power. This machine also doesn't remember its power state. You can turn it off with the power button, but if you unplug the power cord, wait for the capacitors to discharge, and the motherboard's little standby power LED indicator to go out, you plug it back in, it comes right back on again. So I don't know. This thing may very well be consigned to the parts bin. However, before I lose hope, I did mention when I first picked these machines up that this one was by far and away the dirtiest of the bunch. And you can see that there's a very high density of dust bunnies right in front of that massive fan. My only hope at this point is that maybe some of that dust is somewhat electrically conductive. And before you dismiss that or laugh, I've seen it happen before. So I think it's time for this board to come out of here and make a very interesting journey. During my tenure here on YouTube, one of the more popular videos that I have posted had to do with the time when I took an extremely filthy and filled with sticky cigarette smoke-laced dust Dell computer, took the whole thing apart, and threw it into my household dishwasher. As you might imagine, that video generated an enormous amount of commentary from the supportive to the incredulous, and ultimately, the critical. It also generated some discussion on other websites, if you can believe it. In fact, if you were to perform a Google search for UXW Bill, you might stumble across a forum, I believe it had something to do with overclocking, where that particular video was discussed at great length. There were a number of interesting responses on that forum. Many people who commented about my house, at least one person who didn't understand that the Roach Palace is not, in fact, a house I live in, and yet another person who said, well, I wouldn't be above trying that on an old junker PC that I was about to throw out, and I guarantee you I'm paraphrasing there, but I'd never try it on something new. Well, if somebody wanted to donate something new, I might be inclined to throw it in the dishwasher just to prove that you can in fact do this. But in lieu of doing that, I've got this motherboard. As previously mentioned, it seems to have a fairly serious problem. And while it is not bleeding edge technology, this machine was delivered from Dell to its previous owner in late 2008. And that, as far as I'm concerned, means this is most definitely not an old junker of a machine. And I'm going to go ahead and throw this into the dishwasher because, frankly, at this point, there's nothing to lose, and just cleaning up this crud from around these various voltage regulators and stuff stands a fair chance of getting it to come back to life. So let's go ahead and take it over here to the dishwasher. Just set it down. Now, I don't recommend doing this in a casual way just because your motherboard has a little dust on it. It's really only good in cases where things are so filthy that you really wouldn't want to clean them up any other way. And it also bears mentioning that you can clean motherboards by hand in your sink. It is, of course, very important that you allow everything ample time to dry out and that you make sure the board is completely unpowered. In most cases, that simply means removing the CMOS and clock retention battery is more than sufficient. And then you're pretty much ready to go. I'll go ahead and throw this heatsink in here. Do, of course, watch out for screws that might come loose. These particular screws would appear to be spring-loaded and captive, so they cannot come out of this heatsink assembly and thus should not cause any problems. So go ahead and throw these two things in here, and then we'll find the dishwashing powder, which is right here, and we'll go ahead, load this thing up, get it ready to go, and thanks to the magic of video editing, we'll just see what ends up happening here. It might be good, it might be bad, but it'll almost certainly be interesting. Alright, it's time to look in and see what's going on in here, what we ended up getting. Just in case anybody wonders if I really did this. Wow, that fogged up the lens a bit. I'm going to have to fix that. Alright, after a brief little excursion in lens cleaning activities, everything seems to be just fine now. Hopefully I won't go ahead and fog things up once again. It is imperative at this point, should you decide to try something like this yourself, and again, I don't recommend that this decision be made lightly or casually, that you allow everything plenty of time to dry, because if you do not, the results can be incredibly catastrophic. Either the board will die without really much of a sign of anything, or stuff will go pop, bang, spark, and smoke, and you definitely don't want too much of that to happen. So now it's time for this board to dry out. Unfortunately, I don't know if this board will come back to life because I noticed before I put it in the dishwasher that it looks like it's had some exposure to a harsh environment. If you look at these particular ports on the back, you'll see there's some mottling and even a little bit of rust that was there before I ever put this in the dishwasher, and that would tend to suggest to me at least that this computer was used in a potentially abrasive environment of some kind. If I go back up here and look at some of these regulators on the board, you might be able to make out the traces of corrosion that I happen to notice on the top tab of those two intersill regulators. I believe that's who made those. And also this regulator over here, which I can't see the printing on, as well as a couple of these surface-mounted passive components, like these two capacitors right here and that little surface-mounted resistor over there next to that coil wrapped around that green former. Unfortunately, if those have corroded, and it's hard to be absolutely sure in this lead-free solder day and age, as lead-free solder joints can often have a corroded or even bad solder joint looking quality to them if you judge them strictly by their appearance, it's really hard to say whether or not this board has been damaged by exposure to some kind of a fallout. But now, like I say, just have to go ahead and let it dry out. and only time will tell after that. As far as drying something out like this goes, it's a good idea to set it in a place where it can be exposed to gentle but fairly continual heat. A window through which the sun shines somewhat indirectly so you don't melt or deform plastic parts is a good idea. Likewise, you might also be able to speed the process along a little bit by placing the board in the path of airflow from something like a furnace or a simple desk fan. Now that this motherboard has actually had some drying time, I've gone ahead and thrown everything back together, only to discover that while things are no worse, they are most definitely not any better than they were. So something very unfortunate clearly happened to this computer system board, as you can see right there from the amber power light and the blinking numbers 3 and 4 in the power on self-test and diagnosis indication. Go ahead and shut that off. It is my belief that this computer was stored in some place that was extremely inhospitable to existing computers, because as I was cleaning out the case, I discovered more corrosion-related damage once I had mopped up some of the dust. Go ahead and tilt this heatsink out here so that you can see what I'm talking about. I think I've got those screws backed off enough. Maybe not. Go back in there and turn that one out a few more. Yep, that one was still in a little bit. If I go ahead and pull this out, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but right underneath that fan, what looks like dust is actually some kind of rust or corrosion. And on this hard drive cage, the metal parts are quite rusty as well. You can see very plainly right there. You can also see here. So I don't know where this computer was being kept, but it's very clear that something extremely unfortunate befell both it and its motherboard. And so this one is going to be stripped down for parts and then sent on to the recycler. Thank you for watching, and feel free to leave a comment if you have one.